Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking about my top 20 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's video, I'll present statistics that justify the reasons as to why I have these specific players ranked in their current positions in order to give you more perspective as to why I'm trusting these specific running backs and why I'm drafting them in my 2022 fantasy football leagues. Now, a couple weeks ago, I did put out a top 12 running back rankings video, but as you can tell by today's thumbnail, my rankings have shifted, and I wanted to go ahead and give everybody an update in regards to how I expect the top 20 at the running back position to pan out when it's all said and done at the end of the 2022 season. Before we begin, if you have not yet already subscribed, be sure to do so today. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. So if you want to help us get to our goal of 60,000 subscribers, and of course, help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship in your own leagues, be sure to subscribe today. Thank you very much. Now, one thing I wanted to mention before we get into our top 20 running back rankings was that, rankings are always subject to change. Though I may have my rankings as such today, it could very easily change tomorrow. And the 20 names that I'm going to present today are all running back studs. In fact, I'm confident enough to say that I think any of these 20 running backs could very easily be top 12 performers at the end of the 2022 year. The biggest difference is whether or not they meet that potential, how healthy they stay, and that being the biggest factor. But let's talk about health. Let's talk about a player that, in my opinion, should be coming off the board at 1.01 in your upcoming drafts, because Jonathan Taylor, in his short career thus far, has not missed a single game due to injury. This is a stud running back behind an incredible offensive line who's getting an upgrade at the quarterback position. Going from Carson Wentz to Matt Ryan is only going to help this offense find more opportunities in the red zone, which is only going to lead to more points for Jonathan Taylor. As if he needs more points. This man, in the last 22 games that he has played, going back to 2020, has averaged 21.75 fantasy points per game, scored 28 touchdowns in those 22 games, and has totaled 100 plus yards in 16 of those games. That's 73% of the time. This guy's putting up 10 points just via yardage. Not to mention, of course, those touchdowns are always accompanying his performances. That all being mentioned, this is an offense that wants to run the ball. Since Frank Reich joined the Indianapolis Colts in 2018, they have given their respective running backs the second most rushing attempts with 1,588 and the most running back opportunities with 2,053. For those of you who aren't familiar, running back opportunities is the combined total of rushing attempts and targets in a given offense. Overall, they want to feed their running back. He is the best player on this offense, and he'll continue to be the focal point going into 2022. All right, let's move on to a controversial number 2 overall ranking, Christian McCaffrey. Now, in some certain circumstances, we will see Christian McCaffrey be taken number 1 overall in a draft. But the reason why I trust him enough at my number 2 position, and don't get me wrong, you don't have to take him at your number 2 spot. If you don't trust him, by all means, avoid him like the plague. It is nothing that you need to 100% buy in on. And that's why I have him as my number 2 running back on my rankings. Nonetheless, in the last 3 years, since 2019, in the 24 healthy games he has played, he has averaged 24.82 fantasy points per game. That level of upside cannot be attained by any other running back going into the 2022 season. His ability to make plays in the receiving game only elevates his performances on a weekly basis to the point where he doesn't even need to score touchdowns. In the last 3 years, in the 8 games where he did not score a single touchdown, he averaged 18.16 fantasy points per game. Very seldom can we find that at the running back position, which is why we put so much value into the potential of Christian McCaffrey. I mean, shoot, he doesn't even have to play a full 17-game season. If Christian McCaffrey is able to at least play 13 of our games at the rate in which he was the last 3 years, 24 plus points per game, we're talking about 320 fantasy points and being an automatic top 3 fantasy running back, which is what I'm expecting here in 2022. Moving on to our number 3, we have Derrick Henry. I suppose Derrick Henry could technically keep pace with Christian McCaffrey, but the wear and tear that he would have to sustain is quite noticeable, considering last year in the first 8 weeks of the season prior to Derrick Henry's foot injury, he was averaging 29.9 opportunities per game, almost 30 total opportunities, which is a combination of targets and rushing attempts. Throughout that time, obviously putting up 23 plus fantasy points per game. But since 2019, since Ryan Tannehill took over this offense and became the starter, Derrick Henry's been averaging 21.47 fantasy points per game. That's the last 33 games. In those last 33 games, he has accumulated over 4,000 rushing yards and over 40 touchdowns. We're talking about a premier top-tier talent that, yes, his offensive line has taken a bit of a hit this offseason, but is still going to be the main focal point of this team. I mean, even when we go back into the 2021 year and look at the running back position from weeks 11 through 17, when Derrick Henry was out with injury, the total fantasy points that were accumulated from those running backs filling in for Derrick Henry were averaging over 21 fantasy points per week. We know this team wants to run the ball. That's where they continue to find success. It's an offense that has given their running backs the most rushing attempts since 2019. That makes sense. And despite all of the hesitation that many have shown via Derrick Henry because of the injury sustained last year, let's not forget, he just broke his foot. He came back, he performed in the playoffs against the Cincinnati Bengals, had himself 20 rushing attempts in that game. It's not like he tore his Achilles. I understand there is a rule of running backs getting enough touches and then falling apart. Just remember, since Derrick Henry was drafted in 2016, he's only missed 2 games due to injury prior to 2021. Which was one was like a hamstring strain, another one was a quad strain. I mean, really, very seldom do we see this man miss games due to injury, and I don't expect him to do so in 2022. Now, before we reveal the next running back in my rankings, I want to go ahead and remind you guys, if you are looking for my full 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half or full PPR scoring format, the number one way to do so is by checking out Underdog Fantasy. Again, if you go and travel to the description of the video and click on the link and travel to underdogfantasy.com and use promo code Andrew today, not only is Underdog Fantasy willing to give you a $100 first deposit match, but they're also going to include my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings, which I will personally send to you. Again, my rankings consist of by-tiered quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positional rankings, and my top 200 flex rankings. Now, after you sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, it'll take you about 24 hours for me to send you those rankings, sometimes quicker, just depends on when I'm getting updated. Nonetheless, as soon as you get those rankings, besides the first-time rankings that you receive, you'll also get weekly rankings updated for the entirety of the month of August, so that regardless of when you're drafting, you will have updated rankings in order to help you guys out and help you win some fantasy football championships. So again, be sure to go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy today. Get some experience under your belt today with their best ball drafts. And hey, maybe just maybe you get lucky enough to win some massive prizes. So go ahead and check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into our number 4 ranked running back for the 2022 season. That is Austin Ekeler, running back of the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, all I've heard this offseason is the magical word of regression. Andrew, Austin Ekeler's rushing touchdowns are going to regress. He scored way too many last year. It's not sustainable. Listen, I understand your opinion, but let's just take into account the fact that Austin Ekeler last year had the second most red zone rushing attempts amongst all running backs. 47 that led to 12 rushing touchdowns. He had the 6th most red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. Again, those 12 attempts led to 7 rushing touchdowns. And amongst all running backs in the NFL, he had the most targets in the red zone, 16 targets that led to 8 receiving touchdowns. I understand there will probably be regression. Getting 20 total touchdowns is very hard to duplicate. But let's go ahead and let's take this into perspective. Last season, Joe Lombardi, the former passing coordinator and quarterbacks coach of the New Orleans Saints, he came over to the Los Angeles Chargers to be their offensive coordinator. Because of this, we saw a very similar utilization at the running back position in which Alvin Kamara had in 2021 as Austin Ekeler did in 2022. When you put their numbers in terms of total rushing attempts, touchdowns, receiving work, it is almost identical. Austin Ekeler is going to be used like Alvin Kamara was in seasons past. And I think as long as this offense is amongst the top in the league, I mean, again, they're a top 5 scoring team in terms of yardage, in terms of points per game, in terms of passing attempts. They're continuing to find success behind an elite offensive line that they've only just continued to rebuild. I mean, they went ahead and used their first-round selection on an offensive guard when really their offensive line was set last season. They're only improving going into 2022, which gives me that much more confidence in the potential of Austin Ekeler. He may not be a running back that is going to touch the ball 22 times in a game. Last year averaged about 13 rushing attempts and 5.8 targets per game. But overall, as long as he's getting himself 16, 17, 18 total touches a game, he will make do with it because that receiving work and that touchdown upside is going to be there. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our number 5. It is Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Najee Harris is a very special running back. Obviously, in his rookie year, was able to be a top 5 fantasy running back, which hopefully he should be able to accomplish once again this year because that is just in the blood of the Steelers organization. Let me explain to you why. Since 2014, The starting running back of the Pittsburgh Steelers in 6 out of the last 8 seasons has been the number 6 or better overall running back in a half PPR scoring format. The only 2 seasons in which that wasn't accomplished was James Conner in 2019 and 2020, in which he was dealing with massive injuries that obviously excluded him from great periods of time. But whether it was D'Angelo Williams, Le'Veon Bell, James Conner in 2018, or even Najee Harris last year, we have seen top 6 production because this offense has been built around running the ball and doing it at a successful rate. Now, in terms of the amount of exposure to opportunity Najee Harris had last season, he played the most snaps amongst all running backs in the National Football League last season, totaling 86% of the Steelers' offensive snaps. On top of it, he handled 86% of the entire Steelers' backfield opportunity, which leads me to think, obviously, this is a workhorse player. He's going to get himself 18 to 20 plus touches per week. And with that kind of opportunity, it's going to lead to success. Regardless of how inefficient you are and how bad that offensive line was last year, it's only going to improve. They've gone ahead and they've improved their offensive line this offseason. Matt Canada, the offensive coordinator, will have to choose between Mason Rudolph, Mitchell Trubisky, Kenny Pickett. It'll probably most likely be Mitchell Trubisky this season. And to be perfectly honest, I think that's still an upgrade in comparison to what Ben Roethlisberger was doing last year. When you go ahead and look at the splits with Steelers starting running backs, with or without Ben Roethlisberger since 2019, the running back position has gotten a boost of 2.51 fantasy points per game plus on average without Ben Roethlisberger in the lineup. Now, let's not forget, he's a young running back going into his second year. He can sustain the amount of touches that he is going to be given. And we've seen since 2016, young running backs who have been able to rank amongst the top 6 in their rookie season have all been able to, once again, the following year, claim an RB1 standing in fantasy football. There's a lot of potential for this running back. I think 2022 is going to be a great year for Najee Harris. Moving on to Dalvin Cook, our number 6. Again, Dalvin Cook, another one of these running backs that has been incredibly consistent. In 2019, 2020, he was a top 5 back in both years. Yet the injuries that he has sustained over the last couple of years has kind of pushed him down draft boards and allowed many of us to get a discounted, pickup of Dalvin Cook in the late first. That being said, since 2019, with Kirk Cousins under center, Dalvin Cook has averaged 19.92 fantasy points per game. That's the last 38 games that they have played together. That level of production is incredible. But again, like I mentioned, the biggest issue with Dalvin Cook has been injuries. He has never played a full healthy season in his entire career. Yet, he has still been able to be a top 3, a top 5 fantasy running back in seasons past because the amount of production that he puts forth when he is on the field and healthy is top tier. Now, he doesn't have to play a full 16-game season. I'll take 15, 14, maybe 13 games out of him, and I will still find a lot of success because this offense is getting a massive boost in 2022. You bring in the former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams by the name of Kevin O'Connell, a former NFL quarterback, the former quarterbacks coach of Kirk Cousins back when he was with Washington. I mean, they're going to make Justin Jefferson an unguardable force. They're going to make him Cooper Kupp 2.0. You have Adam Thielen, you have Irv Smith, KJ Osborne. They have so many passing threats. It is going to be difficult to stack the box against the Minnesota Vikings in comparison to seasons past. So my expectation is that Dalvin Cook continues his success. And hey, a reminder, you got to draft Alexander Mattison if you are going to be picking up Dalvin Cook. Let's not forget, Alexander Mattison is filled in, and when he has, he's played incredibly well. Since 2019, Alexander Mattison, in games in which he's been given 15 or more opportunities in a game when Dalvin Cook has been absent, Alexander Mattison has been averaging 20 plus fantasy points per game. In those 6 contests, scored 5 touchdowns. A lot of success, regardless of who the starting running back is for this team. I believe in the Minnesota Vikings, Dalvin Cook. Moving on, we have Joe Mixon as our number 7. Joe Mixon has been incredible in fantasy football, despite all of the injury history that he has obviously had to deal with and letting down some fantasy football managers in the past. Don't let the past injuries kind of twist your overall perception of Joe Mixon. I mean, in his career, in 2018 was the number 9 overall running back in half PPR. The following season was the number 13. The following year in 2020, prior to his injury, was the number 9 overall fantasy running back. And this last season in 2021 took a massive step forward and finishes RB number 3 overall. That's incredible production. I mean, when you look at the last 31 games that Joe Mixon has played for the Cincinnati Bengals, since 2019, week 8, he's been averaging 16.42 fantasy points per game while also averaging 22.19 touches per game. He is an elite level in terms of opportunity, production. But the crazy thing is that he's been able to do this with the Cincinnati Bengals being horrible. I mean, you go back to the 2019 Cincinnati Bengals, early 2020 Cincinnati Bengals. This was not a good football team, yet they've been able to consistently run the ball with a workhorse back and allow him to take over games. Now you go ahead and you have a passing threat with Higgins, Chase, Boyd. You bring in Hayden Hurst. Joe Burrow is playing better than ever. I mean, we're in a situation where teams cannot stack the box against this offensive line, and they've gone ahead and they've brought in 4 new starters for this offensive line, replacing left guard, center, right guard, right tackle. I mean, they brought in 3 free agents, drafted a rookie, and they're going to be dominating defenses on a weekly basis, which is only going to help Joe Mixon. Obviously, Joe Mixon's biggest lack in terms of fantasy point production has come from his receiving work in comparison to other running backs in his backfield last year. Mixon totaled only 52.7% of the running back targets. Obviously, Samaje Perine, Chris Evans, they're going to, make an impact in that work. But luckily for Joe Mixon and Joe Mixon managers, the rushing touchdowns certainly kind of leveled everything out and got him in a great position last season. Moving on, let's talk about the player that was on today's thumbnail, Alvin Kamara. I have not talked about Alvin Kamara all offseason because I didn't know what the future held. Now, obviously, in the last couple of days, we have heard, a couple birdies chirp, specifically Adam Schefter, who said on ESPN the other day that it is more and more unlikely that we see a suspension from Alvin Kamara in 2022. Now, over the last couple of months, we have seen Alvin Kamara's lawyers push the date back consistently. They have postponed his, court date, and I think they're going to just continue to try to postpone it. If they end up doing so, and they push it back far enough, the National Football League and Roger Goodell, they cannot serve out a punishment via suspension until that court case has been settled and evidence comes out of it. They always have to wait, see what the court system deals with, see if he's guilty or innocent, and then they'll go ahead and deal their suspension. So if we can get to a position where Alvin Kamara is going to keep getting that court date pushed back, we may see him play an entire full season in 2022, which in my opinion leaves him at the number 8 overall running back spot here. Going into this upcoming year with a fully revitalized offense, in terms of offensive line, the quarterback position back and healthy with Jameis Winston. You got Michael Thomas back. You're bringing in Jarvis Landry, Chris Olave. I mean, this is the best this offense has looked in many years. Last season, in the 6 games that he played with Jameis Winston under center, he was averaging 5.5 targets, 4.17 receptions, but the biggest number, he was averaging 18.08 fantasy points per game on average. That is an incredible number, and if we can see him even get somewhere remotely close to that number in 2022, I think, the sky's the limit for Alvin Kamara. He could very easily get into that top 5 conversation quickly, but he's got to play a full season. Now, in comparison to seasons past, like 2017 through 2020, he saw a lot more targets per game. In fact, was averaging almost 2 more targets per game, which obviously led to almost 2 more receptions per game. In a full PPR, that's going to hurt more, but ultimately, I don't see that being that big of a difference maker in terms of his overall production because I expect the rushing touchdowns to be there, which will allow Alvin Kamara for the 6th consecutive season being an RB1 in fantasy football. All right, moving on to our number 9, it is DeAndre Swift. Again, DeAndre Swift is one of my favorites running backs to draft at the end of the first round, mainly because of the production we have seen him put forth his rookie year, his sophomore year, and now going into the 3rd year in the NFL. My goodness, we've got a lot of potential here on our hands with DeAndre Swift. From weeks 1 through 11 of the 2021 season, prior to his injury, he was averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game. He was the number 7 overall running back in a half PPR scoring format. He was only better in a full PPR considering the amount of utilization he got in the receiving game. Now, going into 2022, this is still going to be a better version of the Detroit Lions, but they're not out of the picture of losing majority of their games. I think this team is still going to be in negative game scripts. They're going to have to fight back hard, and that receiving work that he consistently got all of last year is going to continue to maintain, and he's only going to get better as a player as his offensive line has improved significantly. In my opinion, we're talking about a top 5 run blocking offensive line in 2022 here with the Detroit Lions. We're talking at the level of the Philadelphia Eagles, Indianapolis Colts. We're talking about that kind of level. And though they may not be there just yet, I purely believe that the Detroit Lions offensive line is going to be the identity of this team. I mean, we hear Dan Campbell always talk about biting off kneecaps. Well, if you want to do so, you got to do that from the trenches, and that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to run the ball consistently. While this offensive line is going to be the identity, DeAndre Swift is going to be the face of this franchise as he carries them in 2022. Moving on to our number 10, Saquon Barkley. I have slowly but surely moved up Saquon Barkley every single week. Saquon was a guy that I trusted a lot last season, and he burnt me. And obviously he wasn't ready. But what he has said many times this offseason already is that he's finally trusting his knee. And with that ability to trust his knee and everything that we've continued to hear out of Saquon Barkley just breeds confidence. There is a lot of potential for a running back like Saquon Barkley. And the main reason is if we can get him even remotely close to what he was in 2018, 2019, which again, he was averaging 19.7 fantasy points per game in those 28 games prior to his torn ACL. Obviously incredible production, elite levels. But if we can get him close to that level, considering what this offensive line looks like here in 2022, my goodness, Andrew Thomas is a beast. You bring in Evan Neal, a first-round pick this year. You bring in Feliciano, who's going to play that center position. They signed an offensive guard this offseason, formerly of the Indianapolis Colts. We're talking about a massive overhaul in terms of an offensive line and their ability to be able to run block in 2022. If you can just open up a couple more holes for Saquon Barkley, he is going to show everyone that he's back and maybe better than ever. Now, for those of you who were wondering, Andrew, Brian Daboll, the new head coach of the New York Giants back in the days of 2019 through 2021, when he was the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, he didn't really use the running back position very much. In fact, they ranked number 32 amongst all teams, last place in terms of running back opportunities in those last 3 seasons. I understand that, but they didn't have a Saquon Barkley. They didn't need to run the ball. They had Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs doing everything. This offense needs a running game. And hey, when we look at weeks 14 through the NFL playoffs of the 2021 year, look at what Devin Singletary was able to do. Look at what the offensive scheme that Brian Daboll put together was able to accomplish. Throughout that span of time, Devin Singletary was averaging 18.21 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. There's a lot of potential in this offense, and I think Saquon Barkley can certainly live up to it. Moving on, we have Aaron Jones. Has a lot of potential in 2022. Obviously, in a full PPR scoring format, I think he's a higher ranked running back, but his ability to not only be consistent in the idea that he's going to catch the ball, but to be a consistent touchdown scorer has really defined his career thus far. In the last 3 seasons, he has always been a top 12 fantasy running back. Throughout that span of time, he is at a very minimum every single year put up 1,100 plus total yards, 10 plus touchdowns, and 47 plus receptions. In fact, over the last 3 years, in terms of total targets and receptions, has been the number 2 receiving threat for the Green Bay Packers offense. Saying a lot considering, you had other wide receivers and tight ends there that could very easily have vied for that. But Aaron Jones has found a lot of trust with Aaron Rodgers, whether it is as a dump off or in the screen game, finding a lot of success there. That being said, throughout that span of time, he's averaged 16.19 fantasy points per game in the last 45 games he's played. In that span of time, scoring 40 total touchdowns. Again, this is all while Aaron Rodgers, back-to-back seasons of league MVP, throwing the ball better than anybody, upwards of 35 passing touchdowns both seasons. Obviously, while that was still happening, Aaron Jones has continued to find success year in and year out. And it mainly has to do with the fact that, LaFleur, their head coach, brought in a Tennessee Titans-esque running attack in a scheme that has continued to improve year in and year out. Since 2019, the Green Bay Packers have been the number 9 team in terms of overall running back opportunity and number 10 in terms of overall running back rushing attempts. Of course, as you continue to dominate in that idea, you're going to continue to give your best running back the ball, which is Aaron Jones. Now, obviously, you want to hear this stat, and I'm going to mention it. In the 8 games that the Green Bay Packers played in the last 3 years without Davante Adams in the lineup, Aaron Jones played 60% of the offensive snap, and only with 60% of the offensive snap, still averaged 25.68 fantasy points per game, which leaves a lot of opportunity for one A.J. Dillon to get himself, 40% of that snap count work, and still see a lot of production coming in the direction of Aaron Jones in the meantime. All right, moving on to our number 12, we have Leonard Fournette. Look, I think playoff Lenny still exists. I think his ability to catch the ball out of this backfield is fantastic, but his inability to stay healthy has really, lowered his overall ranking in my eye, and I'll tell you why. Since 2017, he has never played a full healthy season, obviously missing 17 games throughout that span of time. If, in fact, we are to see Leonard Fournette go down with an early injury, and in return, there may be a possibility where Leonard Fournette isn't given that full workload once again, because there is Rachaad White, there is Giovanni Bernard in this backfield. Both running backs have the ability to be receiving threats. Now, we have heard on multiple occasions this offseason that Leonard Fournette has said that the connection between him and Tom Brady is all about trust. He said, and I quote, if Tom Brady doesn't trust you, he is not going to pass you the ball. And that may be the case with Giovanni Bernard or a Rachaad White, specifically a rookie, going into 2022, which will allow Leonard Fournette, regardless of his health, to stay and maintain a top-tier receiving threat in this offense. But let's just put this into account. Last season, from weeks 4 through 14, Leonard Fournette averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game. Throughout those 10 games, he had himself a total of 63 targets and 50 receptions. Now that you bring in guys like Julio Jones, Russell Gage, Kyle Rudolph, other running backs that are going to be healthy in this backfield. You got rid of Ronald Jones. There's going to be a lot of potential for this offense to throw the ball away from the running back position. But Tom Brady hasn't shown that in his career. You go back to the last 4 seasons of Brady's career with the New England Patriots, with James White. I mean, the amount of targets per season, 86, 72, 123, 95. And even on top of that, Bruce Arians and Byron Leftwich, they've always wanted to target their running backs. You go back to 2016, David Johnson, Arizona, had himself 120 targets, 80 receptions that year. They've always wanted to throw the ball to their running backs. I think they'll continue to do so, just maybe not at a extremely high level like we saw, midway through the 2021 year, in which, he was catching the ball 5 times a game. That is an incredibly difficult number to sustain when you take into account the fact that he was averaging more receptions than Alvin Kamara, Austin Ekeler last season at certain points. But hey, we've seen this guy catch the ball a bunch back in Jacksonville. Maybe he'll just keep going and doing it once again this year. That's why he's my number 12. Moving on to Nick Chubb, my number 13. Now let's go ahead and start off by talking about 2 stats. Number 1, games that Nick Chubb has played with Kareem Hunt. In the 18 games that they have played together since 2020, Nick Chubb has averaged 16.03 half PPR fantasy points per game. In the 5 games he has played without Kareem Hunt in the lineup, he has averaged 19.96 fantasy points per game. That is a 4-point swing. And if in fact we are going to see a trade this offseason in which Kareem Hunt is going to be traded to the Rams or to, some other team that is in need of a running back, my goodness, we may be in a situation where we can completely unleash Nick Chubb in 2022. And that's all we've been asking for over the last 3 years. Just unleash this running back in an offense that last season gave their running backs the 3rd most rushing attempts and gave their running backs the 5th most total opportunities behind an elite offensive line that, in my opinion, has 2 of the best offensive guards. You're talking about Bitonio and Teller. I mean, outside of maybe Zach Martin from the Dallas Cowboys, those are the 2 best, run blocking offensive guards in the National Football League. Top tier talent that is only going to help. Now, obviously, the quarterback situation is in a little bit of a flux. I think Jacoby Brissett ends up playing the entire year here. Maybe they go get Jimmy G. But either way, I don't think that Jacoby Brissett is worse than what Baker Mayfield was putting forth last season with the shoulder injury. I think it could be almost identical production. And with that, they're going to continue to run the ball and find a lot of success. If they end up trading Kareem Hunt in the next couple weeks, Nick Chubb flies up my ranking board. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our number 14, Ezekiel Elliott. Now, Ezekiel Elliott in his entire career has always been an RB1. Yet, I have him ranked just outside of it because there is a potential that age and, the amount of touches that he has accumulated over the last 6 years is going to catch up to him. Now, let's just put this into account. Obviously, over the last 6 consecutive seasons, he has been able to, at a minimum, produce 1,250 total yards and 8 rushing touchdowns every year. In the last 4 consecutive seasons, he has had 47 plus receptions. That is incredible consistency, and on top of it, has only missed 1 game due to injury since 2016. Well, I'm not even counting the week 17 games in which he didn't play because they had a bye week or were completely eliminated from the playoffs. We don't count those week 17s in seasons prior. We're talking about just pure games in which he's missed with an injury. Only 1. Now let's remind you, last season, he partially tore his PCL, which was a big difference maker in the overall production of Ezekiel Elliott. I mean, prior to his injury, the guy was averaging 17 plus fantasy points per game, then had an immediate drop for a 10-week stretch in which he was only averaging about 11 fantasy points per game. I think he should be fully healthy. We've heard Jerry Jones say it multiple occasions this offseason. Zeke is going to have to be the focal point of this offense. And for those of you who are, Tony Pollard truthers, understand that last year, even when Zeke was injured, Tony Pollard saw less overall touches per game and less fantasy points per game. It's not like he got a boost of play, and that's why Zeke was struggling. Nah. The entire team shifted away from running the ball because Zeke wasn't able to run as much. That's how you know he's the focal point of the running game and will continue to be in 2022. I think right now his current ADP is baked into the idea that he may end up being a little bit lesser of himself. But in my opinion, I'm still willing to draft him as my number 14 overall running back. I just think there are so many other running backs at this current moment in time that have so much high upside. He's just trickled down the board to number 14. Moving on to number 15, James Conner. Had an incredible 2021 season. I mean, especially considering where he was being drafted, an 8th, 9th round running back. I mean, obviously did the most of what he was given. 200 touches on the ground, somehow got himself 15 rushing touchdowns. Those numbers will potentially regress. But let me go ahead and reiterate the stat that I mentioned in a prior video regarding James Conner. In 2020, when Kenyon Drake was the starting running back of this team, Kenyon Drake saw the third most red zone rushing attempts amongst all running backs inside the 5-yard line. 21 attempts that led to 9 rushing touchdowns. In that year, Kenyon Drake in 2020 had double-digit rushing touchdowns. So last year, they continued that trend with James Conner. They continued running the ball down on the goal line. Last season, James Conner had the second most red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, only behind Jonathan Taylor. He had 16 attempts that led to 10 rushing touchdowns. That level of production was obviously apparent, especially when Chase Edmonds went down with his injury and was absent. In the games in which Chase Edmonds did not play, there were 6 of them, James Conner was averaging 21.67 fantasy points per game. Again, when you're consolidating not only the red zone work, the early down rushing attempts, and the third down receiving opportunity that Chase Edmonds no longer had, and you add it into James Conner's overall production, I mean, those numbers just continue to elevate on a weekly basis. And going into 2022, we should see very similar production. Obviously, the touchdowns could dip a little bit here, but in terms of him getting more and more receiving work, now that Chase Edmonds has gone ahead and signed with the Miami Dolphins this offseason, I think there's a very good chance of 40, 50 targets going in his direction, which will only increase the baseline of his production. All right, moving on. We're talking about our number 16, Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams, despite the fact that he split almost 50% of the touches and snaps last season with Melvin Gordon and finishes the number 17 overall back, is still in that range for me because I don't know what to expect from this offense. Yes, when Javonte Williams has been by himself in this backfield, he's been incredible. We saw one game last year in which Melvin Gordon didn't play. It was against Kansas City Chiefs late in the season. In that contest where Javonte Williams was the lone back, he scored 26.8 total fantasy points. That level of production is incredible. Now you bring in a new offensive coordinator, new head coach, Nathaniel Hackett, formerly of the Green Bay Packers from 2019 through 2021. Of course, we've talked about how much they ran the ball. You look at Jacksonville, where he was the offensive coordinator from 2016 to 2018, and Buffalo from 2013 to 2014. All of those teams gave their running backs an unlimited amount of opportunity, which leads me to believe that Javonte Williams should see a part of that. But it's only going to be a part of that. I still think that the presence of Melvin Gordon is going to impact, whether it is a 60-40 split, there's still going to be a lot of production given in the direction of Melvin Gordon. The offensive coordinator of the Denver Broncos this offseason has said we're going to keep them on a pitch count so we can keep them both healthy for the entirety of the 2022 season. Obviously, with Russell Wilson joining the organization, they're going to be scoring more, and hopefully that will elevate Javonte Williams' baseline production. But I'm not 100% certain that he's going to have 70% of this offensive workload in terms of running the ball, which keeps him here at the number 16 spot. Moving on to David Montgomery, our number 17. Listen, I think I'm relatively low on David Montgomery, and I'll tell you why. David Montgomery, since 2020, has been a fantastic fantasy running back option. I mean, since week 12 of the 2020 season, he has averaged 16.71 fantasy points per game. In the last 19 games, scoring 15 total touchdowns, and in 13 of those last 19 games, playing 70+% of the offensive snaps. Now, I understand there is, the whispers of Khalil Herbert, maybe he's going to be, the second running back in this offense getting a bunch of touches. I'm not too concerned about that. I don't see Khalil Herbert as much of a threat in terms of the receiving work. Maybe he'll go ahead and cash in 100 rushing attempts this year. It's not going to make a huge difference in the overall production level of David Montgomery. I mean, you go back to last season, from weeks 1 through 4, David Montgomery was the number 10 overall running back in fantasy football. Okay, then you go ahead and you see him return from his injury. From weeks 9 through 18, he was the number 11 overall running back in fantasy. That's why I'm thinking maybe I've ranked him too low. But again, the reason why I have him at this current position, Justin Fields, first and foremost, the rushing ability of a quarterback will certainly siphon rushing touchdowns from their respective running backs. You look at the Eagles, you look at the Ravens, a lot of rushing attacks. You look at the Buffalo Bills, the running back rushing attempts down on the goal line are going to pretty much dissolve for David Montgomery, which will kind of lessen his overall production, but that receiving work is certainly going to be intact. That being said, they are probably playing behind the worst offensive line in the National Football League, and because of that, I've moved him down a bit in terms of my rankings. That being said, I still expect him to be a fantastic running back option in 2022. Moving on to Travis Etienne. Playing in his first season, of course, last year during the preseason, that Liz Frank injury knocked him out for the full year. Going into 2022 should be the DeAndre Swift of this season. Again, a running back that is kind of in that fringe, lower end RB2 range. A lot of people aren't certain as to whether or not he's going to have the full opportunity of this backfield. We're uncertain with the offense. Of course, Doug Peterson coming in. Is he going to allow Travis Etienne to be a 3-down back, regardless of the fact that James Robinson has been able to return from his Achilles injury? If James Robinson wants to come in and immediately take early down, running back rushing attempts and goal line work, that could completely kill the overall value of Travis Etienne. But there are reasons why I'm still confident in Etienne this upcoming season. When you look at his college stats at Clemson, again, he was a former teammate and running back of the offenses that Trevor Lawrence was the quarterback of. But in the last 3 seasons that Travis Etienne had, he had himself 4,952 rushing yards, a 7.2 yard per carry average, 70 rushing touchdowns, 102 receptions, 1,155 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. Overall, was an absolute monster in the NCAA and had the most red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line from 2018 through 2020. Again, though, there may be some questions as to whether or not James Robinson's going to come in and make an impact, I certainly think that Travis Etienne is going to separate himself, become a 3-down back, and very easily get into that top 12 conversation if, in fact, this offense starts scoring some touchdowns. Moving on, we have number 19, Josh Jacobs. Jacobs has been extremely consistent in his career thus far, especially in fantasy. You go back to his rookie year, he was the number 18 overall running back, but prior to his injury, from weeks 1 through 15, was the number 11 running back, averaging 13.97 fantasy points per game. Again, the injury ended his season. He dipped down to the number 18 spot. In 2020, with no injuries in sight, was the number 8 overall fantasy running back, 14.32 fantasy points per game. Fantastic. Last year, from weeks 4 through 18, of course, from weeks 1 through 3, was dealing with a turf toe. But after that, from weeks 4 through 18, was the number 7 overall fantasy running back, averaging 13.04 fantasy points per game. Now you bring in the offensive mind of Josh McDaniels, who is going to be the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders this year. You bring in an offense that has Davante Adams that is going to improve significantly as a whole. Let's not forget, Josh McDaniels does not get bored of running the ball. You look at the numbers that the New England Patriots have put up in the last 5 seasons. They have led all teams in the National Football League in terms of running back opportunities. They do not get bored of running the ball. Just like they did with another Alabama running back last season, Damien Harris, running the ball, finding a lot of consistency, and finding the end zone. I expect Josh Jacobs to get into that double-digit touchdown range. It's just a matter of whether or not he's going to get receiving work like he's seen in seasons past. Obviously, they've brought in a lot of running backs to contest that idea, and whether or not he's going to be healthy the full season. I still think he's going to be a great running back, an RB2 with definite upside. Moving on to our final running back, our number 20, Damien Harris of the New England Patriots. Though they do not have Josh McDaniels, I expect this team to run the ball heavily and effectively for the entire year. When you go back to week 6 through 18 of the 2021 season, Damien Harris was the number 7 overall running back in fantasy, averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game while only playing 41% of the offensive snaps. Last season, Harris had the 4th most red zone rushing attempts with 44 that led to 11 rushing touchdowns, and he had the 3rd most red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, 14 of them that led to 9 touchdowns. I think those numbers could very easily once again be present in his overall box score. And if that's going to be the case, then my goodness, the number 20 spot may be too low for him. But I understand the hype and the potential of Ramondre Stevenson. We talked about it in the video yesterday as a mid-round draft target. Ramondre Stevenson is going to account for at least 180 rushing attempts, probably 40 plus receptions, which is going to continue to dig into the work of Damien Harris. But let's not forget, this offense ran the ball with their running backs 408 times last year and gave their running backs 514 total opportunities. We could very easily once again see a 180 to 220 split in terms of rushing attempts, in which obviously Damien Harris is dominating there. And even if, Ramondre Stevenson is going to play that 3rd down role, Damien Harris is going to catch the ball every now and then, but certainly going to maintain as their red zone rushing back. And that is where the value is found and why he continues to be a top 20 back in my eyes going into 2022. Those are my rankings. Again, if you want my expanded rankings for the 2022 season throughout the entire month of August, be sure to go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy today. If you sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew today, not only will you get a first-time deposit match from Underdog Fantasy up to $100, but you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings by tier at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex updated weekly and sent to you on Saturdays. So be sure to go down to the description of the video, click that link, sign up today. Thank you very much. All right, guys, that's today's video. Tomorrow, we'll talk about another subject. But either way, keep drafting, keep learning, and let's win ourselves some fantasy football championships this season, shall we? And until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.